The immortal as model when Velázquez painted Guy de Longchamps. In the spring of 1656, while Diego Velázquez labored on what would become his masterpiece Las Meninas, the Spanish court painter found himself engaged in a curious side project, a portrait of a visiting French diplomat known as Guy de Longchamps. This portrait, now lost to history or perhaps concealed in some private collection, represented a remarkable confluence of minds at a pivotal moment in Western art. Their conversations during these sittings would profoundly influence Velázquez's philosophical approach to representation, particularly in his magnum opus being created simultaneously. De Longchamps, ostensibly in Madrid on a diplomatic mission concerning border negotiations between Spain and France, had secured an introduction to Velázquez through his apparent familiarity with certain influential members of Philip IV's court. How a relatively obscure French diplomat managed such access remains one of many mysteries surrounding this enigmatic figure. Court records indicate he was received with unusual deference for someone of his official station, suggesting connections or reputation beyond what his nominal position would warrant. The portrait sessions conducted in Velázquez's studio in the Royal Alcázar of Madrid actually coincided with the painter's work on Las Meninas. According to Velázquez's assistant Juan de Perea, himself the subject of an earlier Velázquez portrait, the French diplomat would arrive mid-morning, pose for about 2 hours, and then, engage the painter in extended conversation that often continued through the afternoon and occasionally even into evening meals. What made these conversations extraordinary was really their content. De Longchamps, who seemed well-versed in aspects of visual theory that wouldn't be formally articulated for centuries, challenged Velázquez's thinking about the very nature of representation itself. According to fragmentary notes in Velázquez's papers, which are preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, they discussed what de Longchamps termed the recursive nature of depiction, the idea that any representation contains within it the seeds of infinite regression. The Frenchman spoke of mirrors reflecting mirrors with an eloquence that seemed drawn from long contemplation, Velázquez wrote. He proposed that a painting might contain not merely its subject, but the very act of its creation, and beyond this, the viewer's perception of this creation, a circle of creation and observation without beginning or end. This concept would find its ultimate expression in Las Meninas, with its complex play of gazes, its inclusion of the artist within the scene, and the mysterious reflection in the back mirror. What had begun as a conventional royal group portrait evolved, during precisely the weeks of de Longchamps' sittings, into a philosophical meditation on the nature of representation itself. More remarkable still were their discussions on the nature of time in pictorial representation. De Longchamps argued that a painting, far from being a frozen moment, represented a compression of multiple temporal states. He suggested that when I paint a face, Velázquez recorded, I do not capture a single instant but rather synthesize countless moments of observation into a unified whole that exists outside ordinary time. This understanding, revolutionary for its period, bears striking resemblance to theories of perception and representation that would emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. How de Longchamps came to such insights in the mid-17th century remains unexplained, though it aligns with other accounts of his seemingly anachronistic knowledge in various fields. The portrait itself, according to descriptions in Velázquez's notes and a brief mention in a 1659 inventory, depicted de Longchamps standing beside a globe and various scientific instruments, with his hand resting on an hourglass, conventional symbols of learning and mortality that take on additional resonance given what we now understand about the subject's claimed relationship to time. Most intriguing is Velázquez's frustration, expressed repeatedly in his notes, with capturing his subject's essence. There is something in his gaze that shifts between sessions, not merely the changing light, but something deeper, as though I paint a different man each day while the external features remain the same. Later, and a bit more cryptically, He speaks of Titian as though he knew the man personally, yet without the errors that normally accompany such pretensions. During what would be their final sitting, as Velázquez was completing both the diplomat's portrait and the nearly finished Las Meninas, de Longchamps supposedly made a remark that would haunt the painter. According to Pareja's later recollections, the Frenchman studied Las Meninas and observed, "You have created a moment that will continue to exist centuries after everyone in this painting has returned to dust." In this way, perhaps painters are the only true alchemists, not transmuting lead into gold, but transforming fleeting life into eternal presence. What makes this observation particularly striking is that the concept of Las Meninas as a philosophical meditation on art and time would not be fully articulated by critics until the 20th century. Yet here was de Longchamps, seemingly recognizing its significance immediately upon its creation. The portrait of de Longchamps was completed in June 1656, and the diplomat departed Madrid shortly thereafter. Unlike Las Meninas, which remained in the royal collection and eventually the Prado Museum, the whereabouts of de Longchamps' portrait became unclear after Velázquez's death in 1660. Some scholars suggest it may have been among works damaged in the 1734 fire at the Royal Alcazar, while others propose it was gifted to the subject himself and thus disappeared into private circulation. A tantalizing footnote appears in the 1872 catalogue of a private collection in Copenhagen, listing portrait of a French diplomat with hourglass, manner of Velázquez. This painting was purchased by an anonymous collector and has not been documented since. Whether this represents the lost portrait of Guy de Longchamps remains speculation. What remains indisputable is the timing of these sessions and their correlation with Velázquez's conceptual breakthrough in Las Meninas. The Spanish master, already at the height of his technical powers, underwent a profound philosophical deepening of his approach to representation during precisely the weeks of his interaction with the mysterious Frenchman. If we accept the various accounts of de Longchamps' extended existence across centuries, his conversations with Velázquez represent more than just an interesting historical footnote. They suggest a direct transmission of future understanding backward through time, mediated by an individual who claimed to move through time not as a fixed progression, but as a malleable medium. In Velázquez's masterpiece, with its complex interplay of observer and observed, artist and subject, reality and representation, we may be witnessing not merely the culmination of Renaissance perspective, but also the influence of concepts that properly belong to later centuries. Introduced by a visitor who, if his own accounts are to be credited, had already experienced those future developments firsthand. Regardless of whether one accepts de Longchamps' extraordinary claims of temporal fluidity, the documented timing of his interactions with Velázquez during the creation of Las Meninas establishes him as a footnote in art history that perhaps deserves promotion to a full chapter. Another enigmatic figure captured in paint by a master, whose influence may have been far greater than the modest diplomatic role that ostensibly brought him to the Spanish court.